The Witching Hour, a night shift horror story. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. The fluorescent lights buzzed in the dimly lit hospital corridor, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and whisper secrets to those who dared to listen. Sarah had always hated the night shift, but as a dedicated nurse, she couldn't refuse when her supervisor asked her to cover for a colleague who had fallen ill. It was a chilly autumn night, and the moon hung low in the sky, its pale light filtering through the hospital windows. Sarah clutched her clipboard to her chest and began her rounds, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The hospital had an unsettling silence at this hour, broken only by the occasional beep of a monitor or the distant hum of the air conditioning. As Sarah entered room 213, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the monitor illuminating the frail figure of Mrs. Anderson, an elderly patient who had been on the brink of death for days. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. She approached the bedside, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Anderson's gaunt face. A woman's eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Sarah reached out to check her pulse, but as her fingers grazed the withered skin, Mrs. Anderson's eyes snapped to focus on her. "Sarah," the old woman rasped, her voice a ghostly whisper. Startled, Sarah stumbled back. "Mrs. Anderson, you scared me. How are you feeling?" Mrs. Anderson's eyes bore into Sarah's with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. "The darkness, it's coming. You must leave this place before it takes you to." Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss the ominous words. "You're just tired, Mrs. Anderson. I'll get you some water." But as Sarah turned to leave the room, she heard a faint, chilling laughter. It was a sound that seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the empty halls. She hurried back to the bedside, but Mrs. Anderson's eyes had glazed over again, and she appeared unconscious. Sarah rushed to the nurse's station, her heart pounding. She found her colleague, Lisa, hunched over a computer, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Lisa, did you hear that laughter?" Lisa blinked at her, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Laughter? Sarah, you're just tired. It's probably your mind playing tricks on you." Sarah wanted to believe Lisa, but the laughter had felt so real, so malevolent. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in the hospital tonight. As the night wore on, Sarah continued her rounds, but the hospital seemed to grow darker with each passing hour. The hallway lights flickered ominously, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, and Sarah's breath misted in front of her as she moved from room to room. In room 315, she encountered Mr. Johnson, a patient with severe dementia. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, muttering to himself incoherently. Sarah approached him, trying to calm him down. "Mr. Johnson, it's okay. I'm here to help," she said soothingly. But Mr. Johnson's eyes snapped up to meet hers, and they were filled with a terrible clarity. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "The darkness, it's hungry tonight." Sarah backed away, her heart pounding. She had no idea what Mr. Johnson meant, but his words sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent lurked in the shadows, something that wanted to consume her soul. As Sarah continued her rounds, the hospital seemed to come alive with eerie sounds. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways, distant whispers filled her ears, and the laughter grew louder, more deranged. She tried to radio Lisa for help, but there was only static on the other end. In a panic, Sarah returned to Mrs. Anderson's room, but the bed was empty. The monitor lay on the floor, its screen cracked and lifeless. She called out for Mrs. Anderson, but there was no response. Suddenly, the laughter surrounded her, growing louder and more sinister. Sarah felt a cold, unseen hand grip her shoulder, and she spun around to find herself face to face with Mrs. Anderson. But it wasn't Mrs. Anderson anymore. Her eyes were pools of darkness, and her voice was a chilling whisper. "The darkness has claimed me," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice echoing with 1,000 tormented souls. "And now it seeks you." Sarah stumbled backward, trying to escape the room, but the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. She was trapped in the darkness, surrounded by the malevolent presence that seemed to hunger for her soul. Hours passed like a waking nightmare as Sarah struggled to escape the hospital's clutches. She encountered other patients, each more twisted and sinister than the last, all warning her of the impending darkness. But there was no escape, no way out of the nightmare that had become her reality. As the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, the malevolent laughter finally faded, and the hospital returned to its usual, sterile quietude. Lisa found Sarah trembling in the hallway, her eyes haunted by the horror she had witnessed. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, concern etched on her face. Sarah could only nod, unable to find the words to describe the nightmarish ordeal she had endured. She knew that no one would believe her, that they would dismiss her story as the delusions of an exhausted nurse. But she would never forget the night when the darkness had claimed the hospital, and she had come face to face with a horror beyond imagination. Don't forget to like and subscribe.